There's a lake in the middle of Minneapolis that carries two histories at once. For most of the last 2 centuries, it was called Lake Calhoun, named for a man who never saw it, a man who defended slavery as a positive good. Today, the maps say something older and truer. Bde Maka Ska. It is a late August evening, the light is going gold across the water, and we are walking the whole way around. This is the story of how a lake got its name back. Bde Maka Ska sits in the southwest corner of Minneapolis, in Hennepin County, Minnesota, roughly 44.9 degrees north and 93.3 degrees west. It is the largest lake inside the city limits, about 400 acres of water, and the deepest of the Minneapolis lakes, dropping to somewhere near 87 feet. It is one link in a chain. Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles, Bde Maka Ska, and Lake Harriet, strung together like beads through the heart of a modern American city. To understand this water, you have to imagine the place with no city on it at all, and no soil, and no sound. Around 20,000 years ago, the last great advance of the Laurentide ice sheet buried this ground under ice. Different lobes of that ice sheet crossed Minnesota at different times, grinding, carrying, dumping. The lobe that most geologists credit with shaping this exact neighborhood is the Grantsburg sublobe, a northeastward arm of the enormous Des Moines lobe that pushed up out of the Dakotas and swung across the Twin Cities. When a glacier retreats, it does not simply back away like a tide. It stalls, it thins, it breaks. Huge blocks of ice get stranded and then buried under the sand and gravel and clay that the meltwater keeps pouring out. Those buried blocks are called dead ice, and they can sit insulated underground for centuries. Then slowly, they melt. The ground above them collapses into a hollow. Rain and snowmelt and groundwater fill the hollow. That hollow is called a kettle, and a kettle full of water is a lake. That is what we are walking around this evening, a hole where a piece of a glacier used to be. The Minneapolis chain of lakes is a string of those hollows, sitting in a buried valley that the ice and its rivers carved and then partly refilled. Bde Maka Ska is the deep one. Under the paddleboards and the sailboats and the swimmers, the basin drops away to nearly 90 feet of cold, dark, layered water. The lake is roughly 12,000 years old. The city is about 170. The ice left more than holes. It left the soil, the gravel, the boulders hauled down from Manitoba and Ontario and dropped here at random. It left a landscape with no drainage yet organized, which is why Minnesota ended up with more than 10,000 lakes and thousands more wetlands. Every one of them is a scar or a hollow or a dam left by ice. When people say the North is young country, this is what they mean. Geologically speaking, the ink here is barely dry. As the ice pulled back, life moved in behind it, and it did not stay the same for long. First a cold, open tundra, then spruce forest. Then, as the climate warmed and dried, prairie pushed east and oak savanna spread across this part of Minnesota. Big bur oaks with thick fireproof bark standing in tall grass kept open by fire. That is the country that stood here for thousands of years, not the dense woods you might imagine. An open, burning, grassy, oak-dotted land. We are coming around the eastern side now, and this is the part of the walk that matters most. It looks ordinary. A paved path, a low grassy rise, benches, apartment buildings up the hill behind us. There is nothing here that announces itself. But this slope, this specific shoreline where people are jogging past in the evening light, is one of the most significant Dakota historical sites in the city of Minneapolis. And for most of the last century, almost nobody walking here was told so. Before the dredges, this was not a clean bowl of water with a hard edge. Bde Maka Ska was fringed with marsh, cattails, sedges, wild rice in the shallow bays of the wider region, tamarack and bog on the low ground between the lakes. Lake of the Isles just north of us was mostly swamp. That wet, tangled, productive edge was the richest part of the whole system. It fed ducks, muskrat, fish, and people. Almost all of it was later filled in and planted with lawn. This is Dakota homeland. Mni Sota Makos, the land where the waters reflect the skies, is the Dakota name for this country, and the Dakota are here now in the present tense in Minneapolis and across the region. The Anishinaabe, also called Ojibwe, are the other great nation of this state, largely to the north and east. The name of this lake comes from the Dakota language. Bde Maka Ska. Bde means lake. Maka means earth. Ska means white. Lake White Earth or Lake of the White Banks. People still ask how to say it. Roughly, Bde Maka Ska, Bde Maka Ska. It is not a difficult name, and the Dakota families who campaigned for it have spent years patiently teaching a city of hundreds of thousands of people to put their mouths around 4 syllables that belong to this ground. The name is old. Some historians think it may trace back further still, to the Iowa people, who were in this region before the 16th century. Names outlive the people who fight over them. About 7 miles southeast of where we are standing, the Minnesota River runs into the Mississippi. The Dakota call that confluence Bdote. It is a place of profound spiritual importance in Dakota tradition, understood by many Dakota people as a place of origin. Everything that happened at this lake in the 19th century flows from what happened at Bdote first. Because in 1805, and again in the treaties that followed, the United States took hold of that confluence and then built a fort on the bluff above it. The fort went up in the 1820s, and it was called Fort Snelling. The man who authorized it as United States Secretary of War was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. Hold on to that name. The fort was the instrument of American power in this country. It housed the soldiers, the Indian agent, the traders, and the pressure. And it was from Fort Snelling that a United States Indian agent named Lawrence Taliaferro set out to change how the Dakota lived. In 1829, A Dakota leader named Bde Maka Ska, which is often translated as Cloud Man, established a village right here on the eastern shore of this lake. In Dakota it was called Hayata Atunwi, which is usually given as the village at the side, or the village set back, meaning set back from the Mississippi. Cloud Man was of the Mdua Canton, Dakota. The village he founded here was an experiment, and it lasted about 10 years, and it is why this shoreline still matters. The story that comes down to us is that Cloud Man was caught out in a 3-day blizzard on a hunt, and in that ordeal began to think hard about whether his people could rely on the hunt alone. Taliaferro, the Indian agent, was pushing an assimilation program, supplying seed and iron tools to Dakota who would take up American-style farming. Cloud Man took the offer. Corn went into this ground. By 1832, the village was growing a surplus, enough to feed itself and to trade. In 1834, 2 brothers from Connecticut, Samuel and Gideon Pond, arrived at the fort and then built a cabin on this lakeshore next to the village. They were young, self-appointed, and unaffiliated with any mission society. They came to convert, which is its own complicated legacy. But they also did something that turned out to matter enormously. They sat down with Dakota speakers and worked out how to write the Dakota language, devising an alphabet and beginning the spelling system that Dakota writing still rests on. It is easy to tell this as a story of assimilation, and white visitors at the time certainly told it that way. Tourists began coming out from the fort as early as 1835 to look at the village. The painter George Catlin came in 1836, but the Dakota historian Kate Bean, whose own family is tied to this place, has argued for a different reading. That Hayata Atunwi was not surrender, it was adaptation. It was Dakota people finding a way to survive colonialism without ceasing to be Dakota. Think about what that means. The first written Dakota, the alphabet, the first steps of a dictionary, took shape on the shore of this lake in a cabin a few minutes' walk from where we are now. Dakota people taught it. The Ponds wrote it down. And that written language later carried Dakota voices through exile, through boarding schools, through a century of deliberate suppression, and into the language classes taught in Minnesota today. This ordinary grassy slope is, in a real sense, a birthplace of written Dakota. Around 1839, the village at the lake was abandoned. Violence between the Dakota and the Ojibwe had escalated, and this open shoreline was exposed. Cloud Man and his people moved south to Oak Grove, on the Minnesota River, in what is now Bloomington. What followed for the Dakota Nation was catastrophe. The treaties of 1851 took most of the land. The War of 1862 ended in the largest mass execution in United States history, and in the forced exile of the Dakota people from Minnesota. It is worth walking a few paces in silence with that. The people who planted corn on the shore were, within a single lifetime, driven out of the state that took its name from their language. Dakota people came back. They are here. There are Dakota communities in Minnesota today and Dakota people in this city, and some of them, as we will see, walked this shoreline for years insisting that a lake could be called by its right name again. So who was John C. Calhoun? He was a South Carolinian, a congressman, a senator, vice president of the United States, and Secretary of War when Fort Snelling was authorized. Army surveyors mapping this region put his name on this lake to honor him, and he was, above all, the most powerful intellectual defender of slavery in American history. He argued in the Senate that slavery was not a necessary evil but a positive good. He held enslaved people himself. Nobody in Minnesota chose that name in any meaningful sense. Surveyors wrote it on a map in the early 19th century, and the map became the record, and the record became the truth. That is how most colonial place names work, not by decision, but by paperwork. For nearly 200 years, the largest lake in Minneapolis carried the name of a man who never came here, who had nothing to do with this water, and whose life's work was the defense of human bondage. Meanwhile, a city was being built 4 miles north of here, on the only true waterfall on the Mississippi. St. Anthony Falls turned the river into power, and the power turned wheat into flour, and for a time Minneapolis was the flour milling capital of the world. The city grew fast and rich, and it grew outward, and by the 1870s and 80s this lake was no longer countryside. It was becoming the edge of town. The Dakota name for the falls is Mni, the turbulent water. It was a sacred place, and the mills consumed it. That is the pattern of this whole region in the 19th century, and it is the engine behind everything that then happened to this lake. Money made at the falls built the mansions. The mansions wanted a view, and a shallow, marshy, mosquito-ringed lake on the edge of a booming industrial city was about to be turned into something else entirely. The transformation started with rails. A local railway company began running out this way around 1879. A resort called the Lindale Hotel opened on the lakeshore in 1883 and burned down 2 years later. A neighborhood called Cottage City went up nearby. Rowing and sailing clubs were racing regattas here by the late 1870s, and by 1901, the sailors had organized formally as a yacht club. The lake was becoming a leisure landscape, sold by the lot. Then the Minneapolis Park Board did something remarkable and, depending on how you look at it, either visionary or violent. They decided the lakes should be dug out and stitched together. Between roughly 1911 and the 1920s, steam dredges chewed into the bottom of these basins, deepened them, and pumped the spoil onto the surrounding marshes to make dry land. The wetlands were erased. The shoreline you are looking at is not natural, it is engineered. It is hard to overstate the scale of it. Swamp became lawn, bays became beaches. The channels connecting the lakes were cut between about 1911 and 1917, and when the first channel opened, linking this lake to Lake of the Isles, Minneapolis threw a civic celebration that drew a crowd said to be well over 100,000 people. They came to watch canoes pass from one lake into another through water that had not existed the year before. The man driving this was Theodore Wirth, a Swiss-born landscape gardener who ran the Minneapolis park system from 1906 to 1935. Wirth is the reason Minneapolis parks look the way they do. His conviction was that parks should not be ornamental museums to be admired from a carriage, but places people actually used, with beaches and playgrounds and boats. He also believed no home in the city should be far from one. Much of that belief is still visible around us. The path under our feet is part of something called the Grand Rounds, a ring of connected parkways and trails that loops around Minneapolis for roughly 50 miles, tying the lakes to the creek to the river to the north side. It was the idea of an earlier generation of park builders, and Wirth carried it forward. It is one of the great urban park systems anywhere in the United States, and on an August evening like this one, most of the city seems to be out on it. Walk this loop and you are walking a public argument that Minneapolis won more than a century ago. The argument was that the best land in the city, the lakeshore, should not be sold to whoever could pay the most for it. It should belong to everyone. That was not inevitable. In most American cities, the waterfront went to private hands and stayed there. Here, the park board bought the shoreline. That is why there is a path around this lake at all. The water itself has had a hard century. Runoff, storm sewers, and phosphorus turned these lakes green and thick for decades. Since about 1990, a long campaign of stormwater management and phosphorus restrictions has genuinely worked, and Bde Maka Ska has improved more than most, with phosphorus levels now not far above what they likely were before the city arrived. But zebra mussels, an invasive species, were confirmed in this lake in 2018, and there is no undoing that. This is what the lake is now. 3 swimming beaches, a sailing center, canoe racks and paddle boards, and a couple of miles of shoreline trail with the walkers going one way and the bikes going the other. Walleye and northern pike and largemouth bass down in that 87-foot basin. On a warm August evening, the whole southwest side of Minneapolis comes here, and almost nobody standing on this sand is thinking about John C. Calhoun. But for a while, everyone was. The push to change the name went back years, but it caught fire in the summer of 2015, in the weeks after a white supremacist murdered 9 black worshippers in a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and America began looking hard at whose names were on its monuments. A petition circulated. Dakota organizers, among them the historian Kate Bean, made the case. In 2017, the Minneapolis Park Board voted unanimously to restore the Dakota name, and Hennepin County agreed. In In January 2018, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources made Bde Maka Ska the official state name, and that summer the Federal Board on Geographic Names followed. Then it went to court. A group calling itself Save Lake Calhoun sued. In April 2019, the Minnesota Court of Appeals sided with them, ruling that only the legislature could rename a lake that had carried a name for more than 40 years. For a strange interval, the lake legally reverted. The fight moved to the Capitol, where the Minnesota House voted to write the Dakota name into law, but the bill did not make it through the divided legislature, so it came down to the courts after all. On the 13th of May, 2020, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that the Department of Natural Resources had the authority to rename the lake. Bde Maka Ska was the name in law at every level of government. The paperwork had finally caught up with the ground. It would be easy to call this symbolic, and people did, usually to dismiss it. But names are how a place tells you what it thinks of itself. For 200 years, this lake told everyone who read a map that a defender of slavery mattered more than the people who planted corn on its eastern shore. Now it does not. Nothing was given back except a name. But the name was the one thing that could be. The loop closes. 3.2 miles of path, 400 acres of water sitting in a hole a glacier left, the light going bronze and then rose across it, the sailboats coming in. A place that has been a wetland, a village, a resort, a construction site, a name to argue about, and an ordinary evening walk for 100,000 people who love it without knowing any of this. It can be all of those things at once. Most places are. So if you ever come to Minneapolis, walk this lake in the evening and say the name properly. Bde Maka Ska, Lake White Earth. It is Dakota. It is 12,000 years old as a body of water and much older as a place, and it is still here, and so are the people it belongs to. Thank you for watching. Follow for more trails of the world.